I'm Nora, 32, and I never thought I'd stand up to my father at his own retirement party. My hands trembled as I adjusted my carefully chosen outfit, knowing what awaited me inside the Plaza Hotel. Judgment, disappointment, and the familiar sting of not being enough. When my father, the esteemed attorney William Bennett, publicly declared me the biggest shame in this family, something finally broke inside me. I couldn't stay silent anymore. If you're watching this right now, I'd love to know where you're viewing from. Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and get comfortable. This story about finding your voice might be exactly what you need to hear today. Growing up in our sprawling colonial home in Greenwich, Connecticut, I learned early that appearances and achievements were everything to my family. Our house, with its perfectly manicured lawn and elegant facade, mirrored the image my parents, particularly my father, wanted to project to the world. William Bennett wasn't just any attorney. He was a managing partner at Harrington Bennett and Price, one of New York's most prestigious corporate law firms. His clients included Fortune 500 companies and occasionally celebrities requiring discreet legal counsel. The framed newspaper articles about his biggest cases lined his home office walls alongside diplomas from Princeton and Harvard Law. A Bennett never settles for second best, my father would say at dinner, his voice carrying the weight of generations of expectations. This mantra applied to everything from academic performance to the way we dressed for Sunday brunch at the country club. My mother, Margaret, came from old Boston money and had been groomed to be the perfect corporate wife. She'd studied art history at Wellesley, but never pursued a career, instead channeling her energy into charity committees and maintaining our family's social calendar. While she occasionally whispered encouragement about my artistic endeavors, she never contradicted my father in his presence. Then there was my older brother, Andrew. 4 years my senior, he was everything my father wanted. Captain of the debate team valedictorian, and eventually a Harvard Law graduate who joined my father's firm. Their identical crisp suits and authoritative voices made them seem like different versions of the same person. Andrew thrived under pressure, collecting achievements like trophies. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" became the soundtrack of my adolescence. It wasn't that I was unsuccessful by normal standards. I maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA, throughout high school, captained the girls' tennis team, and participated in all the right extracurricular activities that would look good on college applications. I was even named valedictorian of my graduating class at Greenwich Academy and scored in the 99th percentile on my SATs. But while I excelled academically, my passion lay elsewhere. Art had called to me since I was old enough to hold a crayon. I would lose myself for hours in sketching, painting, and eventually mixed media work that combined traditional techniques with unconventional materials. My art teacher, Ms. Abernathy, was the first to recognize what she called my extraordinary vision and encouraged me to apply to art schools. "Nora has real talent," she told my parents during a conference, "the kind that could lead to a significant career in the art world." My father had smiled tightly. "That's lovely. But art is a hobby, not a profession. At least not for a Bennett." At home that night, he'd laid out my future as if reading from a script. Princeton undergraduate, then Harvard Law, like him and Andrew followed by joining the family firm. "You have the analytical mind for it," he said, mistaking my academic abilities for interest in his profession. "And you'll have security, prestige, respect." When acceptance letters arrived my senior year, I'd received offers from all the Ivy League schools, including Princeton, my father's alma mater. But I'd also secretly applied to Rhode Island School of Design and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, both of which had offered me scholarships based on my portfolio. The argument when I expressed interest in these art schools became legendary in our household. My father's face had turned a dangerous shade of red as he pounded the dining room table. "No daughter of mine is wasting her potential on finger painting," he'd shouted. "Art is for people without the intelligence or discipline for real professions. Is that who you want to be, Nora? A disappointment? A failure?" My mother had quietly dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Andrew stared at his plate. No one defended me, so I did what was expected. I accepted Princeton's offer, majored in political science, and upon graduation enrolled at Yale Law School. My father had been ecstatic already, envisioning the new letterhead, Harrington Bennett, Bennett and Price. I made it through exactly one semester. The day I called my parents to tell them I was dropping out of Yale Law to transfer to Rhode Island School of Design was the day I became, in my father's words, dead to this family. He'd ranted for 30 minutes about ingratitude, about throwing away opportunities others would kill for, about bringing shame to the Bennett name. "If you do this," he'd finally said, his voice cold and controlled after the initial explosion, "you're on your own. No tuition, no trust fund, no support of any kind. Is that understood?" I had expected this ultimatum and had already secured student loans and a scholarship. What I hadn't expected was how thoroughly he would follow through, or how completely my mother and brother would fall in line with his decree. The years after my decision to leave Yale Law were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. True to his word, my father cut me off entirely, financially, emotionally, even socially within our family circle. Relatives were told I had made unfortunate choices and was finding myself, code for being a disgrace. I moved into a tiny apartment in Providence that I shared with two other RISD students. The space was barely big enough for the three of us, let alone our art supplies, but it became the first place that truly felt like home. My roommates, Jasmine, a fiber artist from Seattle, and Zoe, a photographer from New Orleans, didn't judge me for choosing art over law. In fact, they celebrated my decision. "Most people never find the courage to follow their passion," Jasmine told me one night as we sat on our fire escape sharing a bottle of cheap wine. "You should be proud." Proud wasn't how I felt most days. Terrified was more accurate. I worked 3 part-time jobs to make ends meet: morning shifts at a coffee shop near campus, weekend receptionist at a local gallery, and evening waitressing at an upscale restaurant downtown. Between jobs, classes, and studio time, I averaged 4 hours of sleep most nights. My hands, once manicured and soft, became calloused and often stained with paint or clay. I developed a permanent line between my eyebrows from concentration. My wardrobe transformed from designer pieces to thrift store finds and paint-splattered jeans. When I caught glimpses of myself in mirrors, I hardly recognized the person staring back. Yet something else was happening too. My art was evolving, becoming more confident, more distinctive. I developed a mixed media approach that combined traditional painting with sculptural elements, often incorporating discarded objects I found on Providence streets. My professors took notice. "You have something unique here," my advisor, Professor Himura, told me during a portfolio review. "Your work has both technical skill and emotional authenticity. That's rare." In my second year at RISD, I met Ethan at a student gallery opening. He was completing his PhD in architectural history at Brown and had wandered in out of curiosity. I noticed him standing for nearly 20 minutes in front of one of my pieces, a mixed media commentary on urban development that incorporated fragments of architectural blueprints. "I've never seen someone visualize spatial displacement quite like this," he said when I approached. "It's like you've translated urban theory into emotional language." Ethan became not just my partner, but my strongest advocate. When rejection letters from galleries piled up, when criticism stung too deeply, when self-doubt crept in during sleepless nights, he remained steadfast in his belief in my work. "They just don't see it yet," he would say, "but they will." Meanwhile, my relationship with my family deteriorated to nearly nothing. My mother called occasionally, her voice always hushed, as if my father might overhear. These conversations followed a pattern. She'd ask about my health, avoid any substantive discussion of my art, express hope that I might come to my senses, and then rush off the phone when she heard my father in the background. Andrew made sporadic attempts at maintaining contact, usually business trips to Boston that allowed him to detour to Providence for awkward lunches. These meetings always ended the same way. "He misses you, Nora," Andrew would say, though we both knew it wasn't true. "If you just apologized, showed some interest in the firm, maybe took the bar exam just to have it as a backup," I always shook my head. "I can't live his life, Andrew. I'm finally living mine." My first real breakthrough came 3 years after leaving Yale. A small gallery in Providence agreed to feature 3 of my pieces in a group show of emerging New England artists. The night of the opening, I stood nervously in a black dress I'd splurged on for the occasion, watching as strangers engaged with my work. A woman in her 60s spent nearly 30 minutes studying my largest piece, a textured canvas incorporating fragments of legal documents I'd saved from my semester at Yale Law. overlaid with images representing creative freedom. "This is remarkable," she said, finally turning to me. "The tension between structure and expression, constraint and release, it's visceral." She introduced herself as Eleanor Wright, a retired museum curator who now advised several private collectors. By the end of the night, she had purchased my piece for $3,000, more money than I had in my bank account, and asked to be notified of future work. I called my mother the next morning, too excited to contain myself. "Mom, I sold a piece to a former MoMA curator." The line was quiet for a moment. "That's nice, dear." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I wish I could have seen it." "You could come to my next show," I suggested, hope rising despite my better judgment. "You know I can't do that." The familiar defeat in her tone said everything about the prison of her marriage. "Your father would never allow it." My father's dismissal of my career never wavered. When my name began appearing in regional art publications, when I secured representation with a respected gallery in Boston, when I was selected for a group show in New York, his response remained consistent. I was playing at being an artist, while squandering my real potential. Each family gathering became a battleground of passive-aggressive comments. Thanksgiving dinners featured pointed questions about my financial stability and remarks about real careers. Christmas gifts from my father were always books with titles like Law School Admissions After a Gap Year or Second Acts Returning to Professional Careers. The worst came at my grandmother's 80th birthday celebration, when a distant cousin innocently mentioned seeing one of my pieces in a friend's home. "Yes," my father interjected before I could respond. "Nora's little hobby. Some people collect her work as a favor to the family. Speaking of real accomplishments, did you hear about Andrew's recent victory in the Hartman merger case?" I had stopped correcting him years ago. The energy required to defend my choices was better channeled into my art, and my art was thriving even as my family relationships withered. 5 years after leaving Yale, I was offered a prestigious 6-month residency in Paris. My work had evolved to incorporate architectural elements that reflected my conversations with Ethan, who was now teaching at RISD and living with me in a converted loft in downtown Providence. The residency came with a stipend studio space and a culminating exhibition at a well-regarded gallery. I sent my parents the announcement, a beautiful printed card with images of my work. My mother called sounding genuinely happy for me, but apologizing that they wouldn't be able to attend the opening in Paris. My father never mentioned receiving it, but what my father never knew, what I never told any of them, was that my hobby had become not just artistically fulfilling, but financially successful. My work now sold for 5 figures. I had exhibitions in major cities. Museums were beginning to acquire pieces for their permanent collections. Critics describe my work as defining a new approach to materiality and meaning. The struggling art student my father imagined when he dismissively referred to my career had long since disappeared. In her place stood a financially independent, critically respected artist whose income now matched what first-year associates at his firm were making. But I kept these successes to myself, partly out of pride, partly because I knew no achievement in the art world would ever measure up to his standards. And then came the news of my father's retirement. The text arrived from my brother on a Tuesday morning in April. "Dad announcing retirement at end of month. Big party at Plaza Hotel on 30th. Mom insists you must be there. Black tie. Let me know if you're coming so I can run interference." I stared at my phone, a knot forming in my stomach. I hadn't seen my father in nearly 8 months, not since a particularly tense Christmas, where he'd spent the entire dinner talking about Andrew's cases, while ignoring my recent feature in Art Forum magazine. Later that day, my mother called. "Nora, darling." Her voice carried that familiar nervous energy. "You've heard about your father's retirement party." Andrew texted me. "Good, good. Well, it would mean so much to your father if you attended." I almost laughed at the blatant untruth. "Would it really, Mom? Because the last time I saw him, he introduced me to his colleague as my daughter who couldn't handle the rigors of law school." My mother sighed. "He's retiring after 40 years at the firm. It's a milestone. The whole family will be there, all the partners, even Judge Abernathy from the Second Circuit. Please, Nora, do this one thing for the family." The family. Always the family. Never my feelings, my achievements, my dignity. "I'll think about it," I said finally. That evening I discussed it with Ethan as we prepared dinner in our loft. Sunlight streamed through the industrial windows, illuminating my latest work in progress. A commissioned piece for a corporate headquarters in Chicago that would pay $500,000, my largest commission to date. "You don't owe them your presence," Ethan said, carefully chopping vegetables for stir-fry, "especially given how he's treated you." "I know." I poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to him. But part of me thinks maybe this time will be different. He's retiring, moving into a new phase of life. People soften with age, right? Ethan gave me a skeptical look. "Has your father shown any signs of softening in the past decade?" "No," I admitted, "but there's also this." I gestured to the massive canvas occupying one wall of our loft. "The Chicago Commission. It's significant. Maybe if he sees that I'm successful on my own terms." "You think that will finally win his approval?" Ethan's voice was gentle but carried a warning. Not approval exactly, just acknowledgement that my choice wasn't a mistake. We both knew I was grasping at straws. My father's retirement party wasn't going to magically transform him into a supportive parent. But some stubborn part of me, the part that still remembered being Daddy's little girl before art and law created an unbridgeable chasm between us, couldn't let go of the possibility. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. I completed the final touches on my Chicago commission. I purchased a dress that balanced professionalism with artistic flair, a midnight blue column with architectural detailing that nodded to my work without being overtly bohemian. I rehearsed responses to the inevitable condescending questions from family friends. "Yes, I'm still painting." "No, I haven't considered law school recently." "Actually, my work is in several museum collections now." The night of the party arrived with perfect early summer weather. Ethan offered to accompany me, but I declined. This was something I needed to face alone. As my taxi approached the Plaza Hotel, its iconic facade glowing in the evening light, my stomach twisted with a familiar anxiety. The same feeling I'd had before every family gathering since choosing my own path. Andrew was waiting for me outside, impeccable in his tuxedo, his face showing the first signs of the same stress lines that had mapped our father's features. "You came." He sounded genuinely surprised. "Mom can be very persuasive." I smoothed my dress nervously. Andrew glanced around to ensure we were alone. "Listen, Nora, Dad's in a mood tonight. Very nostalgic about legacy and tradition. The whole 3 generations of Bennett lawyers narrative is running strong. I'd steer clear of any art talk if possible." The warning was well-intentioned, but infuriating. Don't talk about my actual life, my actual career, my actual achievements, because they didn't fit the family mythology. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, forcing a smile. "Shall we get this over with?" The plaza's ballroom was transformed into a temple of legal prestige. Flower arrangements in navy and gold, the firm's colors, adorned every table. A string quartet played subdued classical music in one corner. Oversized photos from my father's most significant cases decorated the walls, along with a timeline of his career achievements. The attendees represented a who's who of New York's legal community: judges, law school deans, prominent attorneys. Mixed among them were my extended family members, most of whom regarded me with the awkward courtesy reserved for relatives who had strayed from the fold. Nora Darling. My mother appeared elegant in a silver gown that complemented her perfectly coiffed gray hair. She air-kissed my cheeks, careful not to leave lipstick marks. "You look lovely. The dress is interesting." "Thanks, Mom. You look beautiful." Her eyes darted around nervously. "Your father is over with the senior partners. Perhaps we should wait to approach until dinner." "Fine by me." I made my way through the crowd, accepting flutes of champagne from passing servers and engaging in superficial conversations. The questions came exactly as expected. "Are you still doing that painting thing? Have you thought about going back to finish law school? Is it true you live in some kind of warehouse now?" I answered with practiced patience, offering minimal information while redirecting questions. No one asked about my exhibitions, my reviews, my commissions. In this world, those accomplishments might as well not exist. Dinner was announced, and I discovered I'd been seated at a peripheral table with distant cousins and junior associates, far from the family table where my parents Andrew and his wife and my father's closest colleagues were gathered. The message couldn't have been clearer. I was not part of the inner circle. The meal progressed through multiple elaborate courses, accompanied by speeches from various partners, praising my father's legal brilliance, work ethic, and mentorship. Most mentioned the Bennett legacy, with pointed references to Andrew continuing the family tradition. After dessert was served, Andrew approached the microphone for what was clearly a planned tribute. His speech hit all the expected notes: childhood memories of visiting the firm, the inspiration of watching our father in court, the honor of joining Harrington, Bennett and Price as the third generation of Bennett lawyers. My father taught me that integrity, precision, and dedication are the cornerstones not just of legal practice, but of life itself, Andrew concluded. I can only hope to uphold the standard of excellence he has established. The applause was enthusiastic. My father beamed with pride. I clapped along mechanically, wondering if anyone else noticed I'd been completely erased from this family narrative. Then it was my father's turn. At 68, William Bennett remained an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the commanding presence that had intimidated juries and family members alike. He adjusted the microphone and surveyed the room like it was a courtroom. 40 years ago, when I joined Harrington and Price, I had two ambitions, he began: to become the best corporate attorney in New York, and to build a family that embodied the values of excellence and tradition that make this profession noble. He spoke about landmark cases, about the evolution of the firm, about mentoring young attorneys who went on to become judges and political figures. He acknowledged his partners, his colleagues, his mentees. He praised my mother for being the perfect attorney's wife, supporting his career while raising a son who understood the importance of carrying on the Bennett legal legacy. Not once did he mention me. It was as if his family consisted only of Margaret and Andrew. I sipped my water, telling myself it didn't matter that I was beyond seeking his approval. But the deliberate omission stung nonetheless. As he neared the end of his speech, his gaze finally found me in the crowd. Something hardened in his expression. "Family legacy is everything," he said, his voice taking on the steely tone I remembered from childhood reprimands. "It's about honoring those who came before you and setting an example for those who will follow. It's about making choices that reflect not just your own desires, but your responsibility to something larger than yourself." He paused, and I knew what was coming. My only regret as I retire is that not everyone in this family understood the value of tradition and responsibility. His eyes locked with mine, unflinching. "You're the biggest shame in this family, Nora. A cautionary tale of wasted potential." The words hung in the air. Around me, uncomfortable shifting and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some guests studied their dessert plates with sudden interest. Others glanced between my father and me, awaiting my reaction. In that moment, something crystallized within me. 10 years of diminishment, 10 years of being the family disappointment, 10 years of staying quiet to keep peace. I stood up slowly, smoothed my dress, and walked deliberately toward the microphone my father still held. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I crossed the ballroom, the sound amplified by the stunned silence that had fallen over the room. My father's expression shifted from righteous indignation to confusion as I approached. Clearly, he hadn't expected me to respond publicly. In the Bennett family, disagreements were handled privately, appearances maintained at all costs. "Nora," he muttered as I reached the small stage, "this is not the time or place." "You made it the time and place when you called me a shame in front of 200 people," I replied quietly, reaching for the microphone. He hesitated, then reluctantly stepped aside. I could see my mother at the family table, her face pale with anxiety. Andrew looked conflicted, torn between family loyalty and recognition of our father's cruelty. The rest of the room watched with the uncomfortable fascination of witnesses to an unexpected courtroom drama. I took a deep breath and faced the audience, my hands trembling slightly, but my voice steady. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nora Bennett Williams' daughter." I managed a small smile, the one he just publicly called the biggest shame in the family. The discomfort in the room was palpable. Good. Let them be uncomfortable. I had been uncomfortable for a decade. I graduated as valedictorian from Greenwich Academy. I scored in the 99th percentile on my SATs. I was accepted to every Ivy League school I applied to. I paused, allowing this context to register. I attended Princeton at my father's insistence and graduated summa cum laude. I then enrolled at Yale Law School again, fulfilling the path that had been prescribed for me since childhood. I glanced at my father, whose jaw was clenched so tightly I could see a muscle twitching. One semester into Yale Law, I realized I was living someone else's dream. I was excelling at something that brought me no joy, no purpose, no sense of contribution. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I left Yale to pursue art at Rhode Island School of Design. Murmurs rippled through the crowd again. I continued my confidence building with each word. My father cut me off financially, emotionally, and in every way possible. He made it clear that in choosing art over law, I had chosen to forfeit my place in this family. For 10 years, I've accepted his judgment. I've sat quietly through family gatherings where my career was dismissed as a hobby. I've endured introductions that diminished my achievements. I've watched my mother and brother tiptoe around the subject of my life's work to avoid his displeasure. I straightened my shoulders, standing taller. What my father doesn't know, what I've never told him because he never asked, is that my hobby has become a successful career by any measure. I began to list achievements I'd kept private from my family for years. My work has been exhibited in galleries across the United States, Europe, and Asia. I've had solo shows at venues my father walks past regularly, without knowing my art hangs inside. My pieces are in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The expressions in the room were transforming from discomfort to surprise, even respect. I noticed a few people whispering, recognizing my name. The shame of the family has been profiled in Art Forum, the New York Times, and the New Yorker. The cautionary tale of wasted potential commands six-figure prices for major works, and the daughter who supposedly couldn't handle the rigors of a real profession just completed a $500,000 commission for the atrium of Chicago's newest corporate headquarters. I allowed myself a small smile as I saw recognition dawn on a few faces, art collectors who suddenly realized who I was professionally beyond being William Bennett's wayward daughter. In fact, I continued, I'd wager that several people in this room either own my work or have stood admiringly before it in friends' homes or public spaces. You just never connected the artist N.J. Bennett with the disappointing daughter your colleague William occasionally mentions. A man near the back, Harold Friedman, one of New York's most prominent art collectors, nodded in confirmation, looking between me and my father with newfound interest. What my father also doesn't know is that I've never needed his financial support after being cut off. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through art school. I built my career from nothing, with no connections, no safety net, and no family name to open doors. I looked directly at my father now, whose face had progressed from anger to a complicated mix of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. Perhaps most relevant to tonight's celebration of legacy, the biggest shame in this family, established a foundation 3 years ago that funds arts education programs in underserved communities across New England. I've remained anonymous as the donor until now, but the Nora Bennett Foundation has provided arts access to over 5,000 children who might otherwise never set foot in a museum or hold a paintbrush. My voice softened as I approached the emotional core of what I needed to say. The truth is, Dad, my shame was never about disappointing you. My shame was staying silent for so long about who I really am, about accepting your narrative that I had failed because I chose a different path, about allowing you to diminish my achievements because they didn't align with your narrow definition of success. Tears threatened, but I blinked them back. This wasn't about creating a scene or seeking sympathy. This was about finally speaking my truth. The real shame isn't following your passion or building a life that brings you purpose. The real shame is living your life solely to please someone else. I'm not ashamed of who I am anymore. I'm proud of the artist, the woman, and yes, the daughter I've become, even if you're not. I handed the microphone back to my father, whose hand closed around it mechanically. Congratulations on your retirement, Dad. I wish you happiness in this next chapter. As I turned to walk away, the silence in the ballroom was absolute. Then from somewhere near the back, a single person began to clap. Others joined the applause building until it filled the room. Not everyone participated. Many of my father's old guard colleagues remained stone-faced. But enough people rose to their feet that the message was clear, my words had resonated. I returned to my table, legs shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to ebb. I hadn't planned to make a scene, hadn't intended to hijack my father's retirement party. But after a decade of diminishment, the public shame had been the final straw. The formal program resumed awkwardly. My father, always the consummate professional, recovered his composure and thanked everyone for attending. The string quartet began playing again. Guests filtered toward the bar or formed conversation clusters. The buzz of discussion undoubtedly centered on the unexpected father-daughter confrontation they had witnessed. I was gathering my clutch, preparing to make a discreet exit, when my mother appeared at my side. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice uncharacteristically firm. "And your father does too. In private." She led me to a small anteroom off the main ballroom, where my father was already waiting, his back to the door, as he stared out a window overlooking Fifth Avenue. He turned as we entered, his expression unreadable. "What were you thinking?" he demanded without preamble. "This was my retirement celebration, not a platform for your grievances." "My grievances," I repeated, incredulous. "You publicly called me the shame of the family. What did you expect me to do?" "I expected you to handle it privately, as Bennetts have always done. Like you handled your disappointment in me privately by announcing it to everyone who matters in your professional world." My mother stepped between us. "Please, both of you, this has gone far enough." My father's face was flushed with anger. "Did you plan this to humiliate me at my own retirement party?" "No," I said honestly. "I came here hoping, stupidly it seems now, that after 10 years you might finally acknowledge that my choice, while different from what you wanted, wasn't wrong. That you might see me as a successful adult rather than a rebellious child. I never intended to speak publicly until you decided to shame me in front of everyone." "You've been hiding your success," he accused, seizing on the least relevant aspect of the situation, "deliberately keeping me in the dark about your career." "Hiding?" I laughed bitterly. "I've sent you exhibition announcements for years. I've mentioned my work at every family gathering only to have you change the subject. Mom has my press clippings. She keeps them in a box in her closet. I stopped explicitly telling you about my achievements because you made it abundantly clear you didn't consider them worthwhile." My mother looked stricken. "You know about the clippings." "Of course I do. Aunt Linda told me years ago." My father paced the small room. "This is absurd. You've created this narrative that I'm some kind of monster, when all I ever wanted was for you to live up to your potential." "No," I corrected him. "You wanted me to live up to your expectations. There's a difference. A law career would have provided security, prestige, a clear path forward. I have all of that, just not in the field you chose for me." He shook his head dismissively. "Art is subjective, unstable. One day you're in favor, the next you're forgotten. Kind of like law firm partners." I couldn't resist the jab. My father's face darkened. "You deliberately sabotaged my special day. I want you to go back out there and apologize." "Apologize?" I stared at him in disbelief. "For defending myself after you publicly humiliated me, no. Then we have nothing more to discuss." His voice was cold, final. "If you can't acknowledge the hurt you've caused this family with your selfishness, then perhaps it's better if you don't attend family functions going forward." The ultimatum hung in the air between us. My mother gasped softly. "William, surely you don't mean—" "I do," he cut her off. "I've tolerated her rebellion for a decade. I've maintained appearances despite her choices. But I will not have my authority and judgment questioned in public, least of all by my own child." I looked at my father, really looked at him, and saw for the first time how small he appeared despite his physical stature, how limited his view of the world of family of success had always been. "That's your choice," I said quietly, "just as pursuing art was mine. But understand this, I'm not apologizing for telling the truth, and I'm not apologizing for building a life that brings me fulfillment." I turned to my mother, whose eyes brimmed with tears. "I love you, Mom. You know how to reach me if you want to talk." Then I walked out of the anteroom, through the ballroom where curious eyes followed my progress, and into the warm May evening. As I descended the plaza's front steps, I felt a curious mixture of grief and liberation. Something significant had ended tonight, but perhaps something new had begun as well. I texted Ethan, "Coming home. It went about as expected." His reply came instantly. Already in a cab heading your way. Meet you out front. As I waited on Fifth Avenue for Ethan's arrival, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time in my adult life, I'd spoken my complete truth to my father. The consequences might be painful, but the honesty was long overdue. 10 minutes later, Ethan's taxi pulled up. He took one look at my face and opened his arms without a word. I stepped into his embrace, finally allowing the tears to come. "Let's go home," he murmured into my hair. "We can talk about it there." Home. Not the imposing Connecticut house where I'd grown up walking on eggshells, but our sunlit loft filled with art books and the life we'd built together. A place where I was valued for exactly who I was. For the first time, I understood that I'd already found the acceptance I'd been seeking from my father. Not from him, but from myself. The weeks following my father's retirement party were eerily quiet. No calls from my mother, despite my invitation to reach out. No texts from Andrew, though this wasn't entirely surprising. He had always been caught in the middle, unwilling to openly defy our father, yet uncomfortable with the family's treatment of me. I threw myself into preparations for the installation of my Chicago commission, channeling the emotional turmoil of the confrontation into my work. The piece, a suspended arrangement of interconnected sculptural forms that changed appearance as viewers moved around it, had evolved from my original concept to incorporate themes of perspective and revelation that directly reflected my recent experience. "It's your most powerful work yet," Ethan observed one evening as I made final adjustments to the scale model in our loft. "There's a clarity to it, a boldness that wasn't there before." "Funny how publicly confronting your lifelong oppressor will do that," I said, only half joking. 3 weeks after the retirement party, my gallery in New York called. "Nora, you might want to sit down for this," my dealer Jane began. "The Whitney is interested in acquiring your structural memory series for their permanent collection. All 4 pieces." The news should have elated me. This acquisition would represent a significant milestone in my career, institutional validation of the highest order. Yet my first thought was, I wish I could tell my parents. "That's amazing," I managed. "There's more," Jane continued. "Harold Friedman called this morning. He's interested in commissioning a major work for his foundation's new building in Tribeca." Harold Friedman, the prominent collector who had been at my father's retirement party, who had heard my speech, who had apparently connected the dots between William Bennett's daughter and the artist N.J. Bennett, whose work he admired. "Did he mention where he got the idea to contact me now?" I asked. Jane hesitated. "He said something about recently discovering a personal connection. Is there something I should know?" I sighed. "It's complicated family stuff. Nothing that affects the work." After hanging up, I sat at my work table surrounded by materials for the Chicago installation and allowed myself to fully feel the bittersweet nature of this professional triumph. The Whitney acquisition was a dream come true, yet the people whose approval I had sought for so long wouldn't share in my achievement. That evening, the doorbell to our loft rang unexpectedly. Ethan and I exchanged puzzled glances. We rarely received unannounced visitors to our combined home studio space. I opened the door to find my mother standing there, looking small and uncertain in the industrial hallway of our building. "Mom," I stepped back in surprise. "How did you find our address, Andrew?" she admitted. "May I come in?" I ushered her inside, watching as she took in the space. The high ceilings, the wall of windows, the separate areas for living and creating art. Her eyes widened at the massive components of my Chicago commission occupying one section of the loft. "This is where you live, where you work." There was wonder in her voice, as if she'd expected something entirely different. "Home and studio," I confirmed. "Ethan and I renovated it ourselves a few years ago." "It's beautiful," she said softly. "So full of light." Ethan discreetly excused himself to run errands, giving us privacy. I made tea, and we sat at the kitchen island, an awkward silence stretching between us. "I'm sorry I haven't called," she finally said. "Things have been difficult." "I can imagine." I kept my tone neutral, waiting for her to continue. "Your father," she began, then stopped recalibrating. "No, I need to take responsibility for my own actions or inactions. I failed you, Nora. For years I've stood by while your father dismissed your choices, diminished your achievements. I convinced myself I was keeping the peace, but really I was being a coward. The frank admission stunned me. My mother had always been the diplomatic one, the peacemaker, the one who smoothed ruffled feathers, but never directly challenged the status quo. "What changed?" I asked, "seeing you stand up to him at the party." Her eyes filled with tears. Hearing you list all those accomplishments I knew about but never properly acknowledged. Watching you speak your truth with such dignity while he— She shook her head. "I was ashamed, Nora. Not of you, never of you, but of myself, for not defending you all these years." I reached across the counter and took her hand. "You were in an impossible position." "No," she said firmly. "That's the excuse I've used for decades. The truth is I had choices. I could have supported you openly. I could have insisted your father treat you with respect. I could have attended your exhibitions without his permission." She squeezed my hand. "Did you know I minored in studio art at Wellesley before I met your father?" This was news to me. "You never mentioned it." "William thought it was frivolous. He said it wasn't the kind of thing the wife of a rising attorney should discuss in professional circles. So I stopped painting, stopped talking about art, eventually stopped visiting museums unless it was for a client dinner or charity event." Her revelation cast our relationship in a new light. Perhaps her secret collection of my press clippings hadn't just been maternal pride, but a vicarious connection to the artistic path she'd abandoned. "It's not too late, you know," I said gently, "to start painting again." A small smile touched her lips. "Actually, I ordered supplies last week. Just basic things to begin with. I don't have your talent, but I thought maybe it would be something we could share." Tears pricked my eyes. "I'd like that." She straightened, composing herself. "I've also told your father that I'll be attending your installation opening in Chicago next month with or without him. Andrew and Lisa want to come too." "Really?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "And how did Dad take that?" "Not well," she admitted. "But I've decided that's his problem, not mine." "Not anymore." We talked for nearly 2 hours. Really talked perhaps for the first time in my adult life. She asked thoughtful questions about my creative process, my influences, my upcoming projects. I showed her my portfolio, explaining the evolution of my work over the past decade. She told me about her growing dissatisfaction with the restricted role she'd played in my father's world, her tentative steps toward reclaiming parts of herself that had been suppressed. As she prepared to leave, she paused by the scale model for my Chicago installation. "It's extraordinary, Nora. The way it changes as you move around it, seeing different aspects from different perspectives. It's profound." "That's the whole point," I said. "Nothing is just one thing. Understanding depends on where you stand, how willing you are to move to see from multiple angles." She nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I've been standing in the same place for a very long time. It's disorienting to move, but I'm beginning to see things I couldn't before." As I hugged her goodbye, she whispered, "I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for that failure. But know that I see you now, and I'm so, so proud." 3 days later, Andrew called. Our conversation was less emotional, but no less significant. He admitted to feeling conflicted about the retirement party confrontation, understanding my perspective, but conditioned by years of appeasing our father. "I envied you, you know," he confessed, "your courage to walk away from the path he laid out. I've sometimes wondered if I became a lawyer because it's what I truly wanted, or because it was easier than disappointing him." "It's not too late to change course if you're unhappy," I suggested. "I don't think I am unhappy exactly. I enjoy aspects of the work. But seeing you that night speaking your truth without apology, it made me question how much of my life has been shaped by avoiding his disapproval, rather than pursuing what fulfills me." Andrew promised to visit the loft soon, expressing genuine interest in seeing my work up close. "I've been doing some research," he admitted somewhat sheepishly. "Reading the articles about you online. You're kind of a big deal in the art world, aren't you?" I laughed. "I do okay. More than okay from what I've read. Dad has no idea, does he, about how successful you really are?" "He could have," I pointed out, "if he'd ever bothered to ask or listen." "I'm sorry I didn't listen either." Andrew said quietly. That's going to change. The Chicago installation opening arrived in a flurry of last-minute adjustments and press interviews. As promised, my mother attended, accompanied by Andrew and his wife Lisa. My father was conspicuously absent, though I hadn't really expected him to come. The event was a triumph. Art critics praised the piece's conceptual depth and technical innovation. The corporate clients were thrilled with how it transformed their atrium. Curators from several major museums attended, leading to discussions about future commissions. At the reception afterward, I introduced my mother and brother to colleagues, collectors, and critics who knew my work well. Watching my mother engage in animated conversations about contemporary art with the director of the Art Institute of Chicago, seeing her in her element in a way I never had before, was its own kind of victory. As the evening wound down, Andrew pulled me aside. "This is incredible, Nora. I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were successful, but this is another level entirely." "Thanks," I said, genuinely touched by his enthusiasm. "It means a lot that you came. I wouldn't have missed it." He hesitated, then added, "Dad asked about it, yesterday." He tried to sound casual, but I could tell he was curious. I wasn't sure how to respond to this information. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as too little too late. Another part, the part that had sought his approval for so long, felt a flicker of hope. "The installation will be here permanently," I said finally, "if he ever wants to see it." 2 days after returning from Chicago, I received an unexpected email. The subject line read simply, "Your work." The sender, William Bennett. My finger hovered over the delete button before curiosity won out. The message was brief and formal. "Nora Harold Friedman showed me images of your installation in Chicago. The craftsmanship is impressive. The concept is thought-provoking. I would like to see it in person when I'm in Chicago next month for a legal conference. William Bennett." No dad, no warmth, but also no dismissal of my work as a hobby or a waste of potential. Coming from my father, this represented a seismic shift. I replied with equal brevity, providing information about the building's location and hours. Then I added, "The piece changes significantly depending on the time of day and the quality of light. Morning offers the most complete experience." His response came within an hour. "I'll make time in the morning then." A month later, my phone rang with my father's number, the first direct contact since the retirement party confrontation. I answered with trepidation. "Nora." His voice sounded different, older perhaps, or simply less certain. "I saw your installation today." "What did you think?" I asked, bracing for criticism. A long pause. "It was not what I expected." "In what way?" "It's architectural, mathematical even. There's a precision to it I didn't anticipate. The way light moves through it, creating different patterns depending on where you stand." He cleared his throat. "I spent nearly 2 hours there. I hadn't planned to stay that long." Coming from my father, this was extraordinary praise, even if couched in clinical observation, rather than emotional response. "Thank you for going," I said, unsure how else to respond. "I've been thinking about what you said at the retirement party." His voice became more measured, the attorney choosing his words carefully. "About building a life that brings you fulfillment rather than living to please others." I waited, hardly daring to hope for what might come next. "I may have been too rigid in my expectations," he continued, "too quick to dismiss paths different from my own." It wasn't an apology, not explicitly. But from William Bennett, this admission represented an unprecedented concession. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. Another pause, longer this time. "Your mother tells me you have an exhibition opening in New York next month." "Yes, at Brickman Gallery in Chelsea." "Would it be acceptable if we attended, your mother and I?" The question took me completely by surprise. "You want to come to my exhibition? If the invitation is still open." His tone suggested this was costing him considerable pride. "Of course," I managed. "I'll have the gallery send you details." After we hung up, I sat in my studio, turning the conversation over in my mind. Was this the beginning of reconciliation, or merely a tentative ceasefire? Only time would tell. The exhibition opening arrived on a crisp October evening. The gallery was packed with collectors, critics, and artists, the usual crowd for a well-established mid-career retrospective. I circulated through the space discussing my work, accepting congratulations, trying not to obviously watch the door for my parents' arrival. An hour into the event, they appeared. My mother looking elegant and at ease, my father stiff but present in a perfectly tailored suit. Andrew and Lisa arrived shortly after completing the unexpected family reunion. My mother embraced me warmly. My father offered a formal handshake, then surprised me by adding an awkward pat on the shoulder, his version of physical affection. "The space looks impressive," he commented, glancing around the crowded gallery. "Let me show you the works," I offered, as I guided them through the exhibition, explaining the evolution of my artistic approach over the past decade. I watched my father's face carefully. He asked questions, not condescending ones about whether people actually pay for this sort of thing, but thoughtful inquiries about techniques, materials, and conceptual frameworks. He was making an effort to understand even if he might never fully appreciate. Near the end of our tour, we stopped before one of my earliest pieces from art school, a mixed media work that incorporated fragments of my Yale Law School acceptance letter and first semester exam notes, transformed into a sculpture about paths taken and abandoned. My father studied it for a long time. "This is about your decision to leave law school," he said finally, not a question. "Yes," I confirmed. "It was one of the first pieces I made at RISD. Working through that choice, I guess." He nodded slowly. "It must have taken courage to walk away from the expected path." "It was terrifying," I admitted, "but necessary. Perhaps more courage than staying the course." The words were so quiet I almost missed them. When I looked at him in surprise, he was still studying the artwork, avoiding my gaze. But he had said it, and we both knew what it had cost him. Later, as the opening wound down, my father approached me again. "The foundation you mentioned in your speech, the one that funds arts education. Tell me more about that." I explained the Nora Bennett Foundation's work, the programs in public schools, the scholarships, the community art spaces we'd helped establish in underserved neighborhoods throughout New England. "You've done this anonymously?" he asked, seeming genuinely curious. "Until recently, yes. It felt important that the focus be on the work, not on me." A familiar furrow appeared between his brows, the expression he wore when reassessing a situation in light of new evidence. "I'd like to make a contribution," he said finally. "A substantial one, with no strings attached." I studied his face, looking for the catch, the hidden agenda. But what I saw instead was something I'd never expected: respect. Not approval exactly. My father might never fully approve of my choices, but respect for what I had built, for the integrity with which I had pursued my own path, that it seemed he could offer. "The foundation would welcome your support," I said carefully, "but only if you're doing it because you value arts education, not as some form of atonement." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Always direct, Nora. Some things never change." He nodded once decisively. "I believe I've been convinced of the value. Your mother has been quite persuasive on the subject lately." As my parents prepared to leave, my father hesitated, then said gruffly, "We're having a small dinner party next week, Thursday. Your mother would be pleased if you could attend. Bring Ethan, of course." It wasn't effusive, it wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was an invitation back into the family fold, on different terms than before. "We'll be there," I promised. Standing on the sidewalk outside the gallery, watching my parents' town car pull away, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: cautious hope, lingering wariness, but above all, a profound sense of peace. The approval I had sought for so long no longer seemed as vital as it once had. What mattered more was the integrity with which I had built my life and career, the truth I had finally spoken, and the boundaries I had established. In confronting my father, I had ultimately freed us both. Him from the burden of disapproval he had carried for a decade, me from the weight of seeking validation I had never needed. The relationship that might now develop between us would be imperfect, complicated, and occasionally strained, but it would be authentic in a way it had never been before. As I walked back into the gallery to say goodnight to the remaining guests, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. Not the shameful disappointment my father had once declared me to be, but an artist, a woman, a daughter who had finally found her voice. 5 years have passed since that confrontation at my father's retirement party. The journey from that moment of public reckoning to where we are now has been neither straight nor simple. There have been setbacks, miscommunications, and moments when old patterns threaten to reassert themselves. But there has also been genuine growth, unexpected connections, and a gradual reshaping of our family dynamics. My career has continued to flourish. The Whitney retrospective my father initially missed eventually traveled to London, Tokyo, and Sydney. My work is now in major collections worldwide. Most gratifying of all, the Nora Bennett Foundation has expanded to support arts education nationally, reaching thousands of children who might otherwise never experience the transformative power of creative expression. My mother rediscovered her own artistic voice, beginning with tentative watercolors and progressing to bold abstract paintings that reflect a liberation of spirit. At 65, she had her first small exhibition at a community gallery, an achievement my father attended with evident pride, surprising us all. She now teaches art to seniors at the local community center, finding purpose in helping others reconnect with creativity. Andrew remains at the law firm, but his approach has evolved. He established a pro bono program providing legal support to artists and arts organizations facing copyright issues, contract disputes, and real estate challenges. This bridge between his legal expertise and my artistic world has brought us closer as siblings and collaborators. And my father, William Bennett's journey has perhaps been the most unexpected. The man who once dismissed art as a frivolous hobby now serves on the board of the Nora Bennett Foundation, leveraging his legal and business acumen to strengthen its infrastructure and expand its reach. He still doesn't fully understand my artistic process, still occasionally makes tone-deaf comments about real jobs, still struggles to express emotions directly. But he tries. In his own way, he tries. Last Christmas, he gave me a gift that brought tears to my eyes, a leather-bound album containing every article, review, and mention of my work he could find meticulously organized and annotated in his precise handwriting. The first entry was dated just weeks after our confrontation, evidence that he had begun paying attention long before he could bring himself to acknowledge it. "I should have been collecting these all along," he said gruffly as I paged through the album. "Your mother kept her clippings, but I was too stubborn to look at them, too afraid to admit I might have been wrong." That admission, that vulnerability from a man who had built his identity around being right, represented a more profound gift than the album itself. We will never have the easy, uncomplicated relationship some daughters enjoy with their fathers. Too much water under that particular bridge. But we have something perhaps more valuable, a hard-won mutual respect, built on authenticity rather than expectation. The greatest lesson from this journey has been about the power of speaking truth, even when, especially when, that truth disrupts comfortable patterns. For years, I remained silent to keep the peace, swallowing hurt and resentment to maintain family harmony. That silence corroded my spirit and enabled continued disrespect. It was only by standing up, by refusing to accept the narrative that had been imposed upon me, that real change became possible. Not just for me, but for my entire family. We all wear masks at times, presenting versions of ourselves we think others want to see. The courage to remove those masks, to stand firmly in our authentic selves despite disapproval or rejection, is perhaps life's greatest challenge and most meaningful achievement. Whether you're facing family expectations that don't align with your heart's calling, professional pressures that contradict your values, or relationships that require you to diminish yourself to be accepted, I hope my story encourages you to find your voice and speak your truth. The path won't be easy. There will be resistance, confusion, perhaps even temporary estrangement. But the freedom on the other side, the liberation of living authentically rather than performatively, is worth every difficult step. I'd love to hear your stories about standing up for yourself against family expectations, or finding courage to pursue your authentic path. Drop them in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that their truth matters. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. And remember, the biggest shame isn't following your passion, but living your life solely to please someone else.